Hi, welcome to Oma's No Sugar Kitchen.
Oregano.
Let's use fresh pie pumpkins and a pork tenderloin to make October stew with almond flour biscuits. I have a pork tenderloin here, and I'm going to bake that in the oven. I have 1/3 pound of Italian sausage. I have 2 small pie pumpkins. I can get these in fall every year, and I love using these in a stew. It's wonderful. This is the time of year to get pie pumpkins. I have 2 yams. I have 2 large rainbow carrots and a sweet onion. I have some spices, and I'm going to make some broth. First, I'm going to get my pork tenderloin into the oven at 400 degrees because it needs to bake for about 50 to 55 minutes before I chop it into chunks and add it to my stew. So I'm going to slather it in a little bit of olive oil and brush it on. This is an unflavored one because the flavored ones have sugar. So just get a plain pork tenderloin. Some salt. Sprinkle that over the top. Pepper. Now you can use any spices you want, but I'm using those and onion powder. And the main ingredient is smoked paprika, which does carry a little bit of heat, not much, but it will add a little bit of spice to the stew. And a little chili powder. And I'm going to bake this at 400 degrees for 50 minutes, and then I'm going to let it cool before I chop it up and add it. While my pork tenderloin is in the oven, I'm going to make some broth. I have about 2 cups of water here. To that, I will add about a teaspoon of sautéed onion bouillon. Mix that in a little bit. And then about a teaspoon of chicken bouillon. Be careful with these, they are salty. So make sure you test before you add extra salt. I'm going to add those to my crock pot now, even while my pork tenderloin is in the oven. And I'm going to turn it on to high. What this does is it gets the crock pot heated up and ready to cook by the time I add everything else. I'm going to chop up my onion in big chunks here. All right, and opening a pie pumpkin can be a lot like trying to open a spaghetti squash, or trying to cut a bowling ball in half. You need to have some tricks to your trade. So use a knife and insert it in a dotted line all the way around your pie pumpkin. And then you can use a knife to wedge it open. This is the easiest way to open them. And once you get it open, you can scrape out the seeds from inside, leaving the flesh behind. Standard American use of pumpkins is either to buy the huge jack-o'-lantern pumpkins or to buy pumpkin already cooked for you in a can. Fresh pumpkin smells wonderful. It tastes a lot like butternut squash, and I find it a really pleasant addition to a stew. So to me, it's worth the work to scrape out the seeds on the inside, and then I will need to peel the other side so that I can end up with these big pieces of pumpkin in my stew. A small paring knife or 2 works really well when it comes to taking the outer rind off. And you just kind of have to wedge it in there and rock it back and forth, pulling it towards you a little bit and then the rind will come right off. Now I'm going to leave this pumpkin in very big pieces because it will cook down a little bit into the stew. I don't want it to disintegrate. I want it to end up being large cooked pieces. I'm also going to sear it a little bit in a pan before I add it to the stew. The browning on the outside adds a wonderful flavor. So cutting each quarter into quarters is about as small as I'm going to cut it. So I will end up with these very big pieces. Last one cut. And I have this very big bowl of large pieces of pie pumpkin. I'm going to skin my yams or sweet potatoes, whatever you want to call them. And I'm going to cut those into fairly large pieces for the stew as well. I want this to be a nice chunky stew. In the background, you may see a jar of my home canned tomatoes. And if you don't have home canned crushed tomatoes, that's okay. Just buy a large 15 or 20 ounce can of crushed tomatoes at the store. I'm going to put the recipe up here for you while I peel and chop my carrots. Okay, now my pork tenderloin has come out of the oven, and I'm going to let it sit here and cool for a bit before I cut it up for the stew. In my large frying pan, I'm going to fry off the Italian sausage, and then once it is mostly cooked, I will add the onions to it and cook it together with some extra olive oil and let that flavor get all through the pan. Once the onions are cooked, I will add my stewed tomatoes and simmer over medium heat. Now I can cut the cooled pork tenderloin into large chunks for the stew. And this is where the prep work pays off. I can take the lid off of my very hot crock pot and add the giant pieces of pork tenderloin and their spices into the broth. It's already beautiful and it's not even stew yet. To that, I can add the sizzling sausage, tomato, and onion mixture. Stir that in really well. All those flavors start to get together. Isn't that beautiful? So now I'm going to use the same pan with the flavor still in it, and I'm going to add a little olive oil, and I'm going to sear off my large pieces of pumpkin until they're a little bit browned. Adding a little water keeps them from sticking to the pan and helps them to cook a little bit. In the pan they go, over very medium-high heat, almost high heat. I stir them together a little bit to let the water and oil coat. Cover them over. And I want to say that I fry them for about 5 or 10 minutes, stirring at least once, and then I add some salt. And you can see the browned part on the edge of the pumpkin there. That adds so much flavor to your stew. And into the stew they go. Aren't they pretty? Have to be careful pouring them in so I don't splatter it everywhere. And then stir it together. And it looks like there's not enough liquid in it, but don't worry. At the end, we will see how thick it is and add a couple of cups of water and then let it cook down together. But stew really needs to be thicker than soup. Now I will cover that over while I do the same thing with the yam and carrot mixture. Same pan, a little bit of water, medium-high heat, some olive oil, and really get a little bit of a sear on the edges of those as well. And then they go into the stew too. It does make a difference, a huge difference in the flavor of your stew to sear off the vegetables first. Now I'm adding a couple of teaspoons of thyme, a couple of teaspoons of oregano, some parsley, and mixing that in. It gets harder to stir it as it gets thicker. So all of our flavors are together in our pot now, and we just want the right consistency for it to cook down. Isn't that beautiful? So at the very end here, I'm going to heat some water up in my electric kettle, and I will add it to the stew. It's not much, just a couple of cups of boiling hot water. And then we'll cover it over and cook it on high for 3 to 4 hours. It seems like a lot of work until you realize we ended up with 3 good meals out of this crock pot for 3 people. Let's make almond flour biscuits while that cooks. You'll need to melt a half a cup of butter in the microwave and whisk together 2 eggs. Preheat your oven to 350 degrees. Let your melted butter cool a little bit. 2 cups of almond flour. Sorry for the stark light in my kitchen. 2 heaping tablespoons of tapioca flour. This is optional, but it does lighten up the biscuits a little bit. And then we're going to add a half teaspoon of baking powder. The flat edge on the container helps you measure out a flat half teaspoon. Just rub it along there, or a flat measurement of any kind. We're going to add a teaspoon and a half of baking soda, and I use the edge of the box to do the same thing. Teaspoon and a half. We're going to add a teaspoon of onion powder, a teaspoon of parsley, and a teaspoon of salt. And finally, a half teaspoon of pepper. Also optional, but I like the flavor it gives it. Stir the dry ingredients together. Give the eggs a little whisk and pour them in. Then add your melted and slightly cooled butter. And as you mix these ingredients together, let me put the recipe up here for you. It helps to give the almond flour a few minutes to absorb the moisture, and if it's still a little wet, you can add another sprinkle of almond flour and it won't hurt it. Add in 1/2 to 3/4 cup of grated cheddar cheese. I have a foil-lined cookie sheet here, and I'm going to use a tablespoon and a 1/4 cup measuring cup. I'm going to fill that and then drop it onto the cookie sheet. This will make fairly equal-sized biscuits. A little bit of effort, and you end up with this little biscuit dough on there. I really need to make these almond flour biscuits their own video because I use these in a lot of ways, and because they are mostly almond flour and eggs, they don't produce a blood sugar spike for me at all. Plus, they're really good. Depending on how much you've filled up your measuring cup, this produces 9 or 10 biscuits, and you're going to want to bake them in the oven at 350 degrees for 22 to 24 minutes. Keep an eye on them in the last minute or two. And they come out beautiful. They're tall and crumbly and wonderful. It's time to do some plating, and I love to make sure everybody gets a big piece of the pork tenderloin and a few big pieces of the pumpkin as well, mixed with everything else. This is such a hearty and wonderful stew. The flavor is excellent. I'm serving it with the almond flour biscuits, some fruit, a cheese board, and some quick pickle cucumber and tomatoes mixed together, which are excellent on the almond flour biscuits. Thank you for making October stew with me, and I hope you'll give this one a try. It is definitely worth the effort. Thank you for joining me in Oma's Kitchen. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll upload more tasty videos soon, and a special shout out to Moon Pie and Lil Bit. Till next time.